Hello, everybody. Welcome to the digital version of the class today. I'm going to go over some of the practice problems that we would have done in class if not for the snow day. Encourage you to go through these videos as many times as you need to clarify, anything that you are having trouble with. The best way to go about it is really to try these problems on your own, then come watch the videos. If you're confused on anything, you had trouble getting it to work, the idea is these will kind of help explain and walk through the code for you. All right, so let's just jump right in here and let's look at the question number one. And so the goal of this question here is to see if we can kind of tackle a problem where we have a array that has which is really a string, right? We've got a string called quote, and this is actually a Steve Jobs quote that is stored in the string called quote, right? So we can store up to 128 characters, and you can see here that we can actually store it because the multiple lines, just from a formatting perspective, because it does not really go to the next instruction until we hit this semicolon. So from a formatting perspective, it makes it a little easier to kind of put it on separate lines here, and there's no issue with doing that. All right, so the idea here is we want to basically write some code that gets the length of the string, and one way to do that is to the example shown here, where we're actually using the string library. This include statement must be in here for this to work, and the string library includes this function here called strlen, or string length. And if we give this the input into that, if we give this the name of the string, quote, it will tell us the length of the string. Now, notice the length of the string is not this 128, right? Not that 128. Instead, the length of the string is how many characters are actually needed to store it, right? How many characters are needed to store that full, that are actually stored within the string. So that 120 is really an upper bound of how many you can fit in there. And the 99 is how many we actually are storing in there. Okay, so that's the goal here. That's what we're trying to accomplish. And let's now flip over to what the solutions look like for this. Okay, so here's the solutions for the first part. And you could see that the top part is all the same things that was in the example code that was provided to you. So we're going to try to get the same number here without using the string length function. That's the idea. And the purpose of this is it forces you to kind of understand how this function is built, right? It's a really good practice to be able to understand how those functions are built, because a lot of times what computer science folks do is you're building these functions, and we'll see how to do that later on in the course. But you're building those functions for either other people in your organization to use or for yourself to use, and so you need to be able to understand how to kind of create this code that other people can leverage. So you're basically creating the libraries, the code libraries. So let's look at how this library, like a way that the string length function, how it works, is what we're really doing here is we're iterating the array. So remember, strings are really a array of characters. So let's just imagine if we had an array that looked like this, and if I had in here, let's just say, imagine I had the word hello was the only thing in the string, that this character here at the end with the /0 is our null terminator character. Okay, that's our null terminator. That indicates the end of the string, even though we might have 128 total characters that could be fit in the size of that array. Okay, so what this is doing down here is we are continuing to iterate until we hit this null character. Okay, when we hit that null character, that null terminator, we stop. Okay. Every time we iterate, we're going to bump our count. We're starting length at 0. In this case, we would see is length starts at 0, right? We get to H, that would change to go to 1, then E, it would go to 2, and so on. L again, O, and it stops when it hits the null terminator, so we would be printing out that value. Okay, so that's the magic that makes that work. That's really how this string length function is implemented, and that's good to know. Like, you kind of start to understand the internal workings of these functions and what they're doing, and basically a sense of how long they take to process by what they need to compute to get the result. So let's move on. Let's take a look at the next question. Feel free to rewatch some of these explanations if you need kind of some more detail. Keeping in mind some of the things just to kind of review that we've got the when we're printing out the integer, we have the %d as the format specifier for integers, and then we're printing out the length. Let's kind of press ahead here and let's take a look at the next one. Let's look at question 2. It says to find the location of the first space character. Okay, and so what this is doing is, if we looked at the example above, we would see that the first space character is going to be this character right here, right after the first word, which is everyone. We're getting 8 being the location. Right, so if we start at index 0, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8. This is an index 8 is the location for 8 is the location of that space character. Okay, so let's go and look at the code for that as well. Oops. So how do we do that? Well, here I'm going to use the string length function because we're going to print to the end of the string. Okay, and oftentimes what we find useful is what we're trying to do is we want to print this index. That's going to be our result. So I'm going to initialize and declare and initialize it. And a common way of initializing something is to kind of indicate, like if it's a number, if it's an integer, is -1 indicating that it's not found, something like that, right? If it's not found or kind of undefined, sometimes -1 stands for that, like something went wrong, like an error message. So I'm going to initialize it to -1. That would be what would happen if we never found a space character in the entire string. Okay, so here we're going to iterate through the entire. We're going to iterate through the string. Let me kind of do another illustration here. If we had our string called quote, and this time I'm going to put, just like the example we had before, I'm going to put the word everyone in here, and then we have a space, and then we had some other text like should, I think was the next word, so on. Okay, so what happens here is we're going to start at E on the left hand side at index 0. Remember, all arrays start at index 0 and count up. And we are looking at each time we iterate through the array for a space. So we're going to start here at E, and we're going to continue flipping through. And at some point, when I equals 8, this condition's true. Okay, at that location. When that happens, we're going to set index equal to I. Right? In that case, I is 8 at that moment, and then something that we really glanced over at the last learning module, which makes sense to kind of revisit in this example, is this break command. Notice that it's a reserved word, meaning that it's something that the C language recognizes as being kind of built into the language. It shows up in blue here to kind of identify that. And what will happen is that when we hit that break statement, that's an indication that we actually want to forcibly terminate the loop. Okay, that forces the loop to exit, because then it makes sense for us to do that at this point in time, right? When we hit this statement, when we hit this blank space, we're now found what we were looking for. We're looking for the first space character. We don't want to continue looking, so we're going to force the loop to end. There's not that many scenarios that the break statement's used for. It's not used incredibly often, but there's some times where it's very helpful to do that. You could always, the break is a little cleaner. The other way you could have done the same logic is you just set I to greater than or equal to the length of the string, and that would force it to end the loop as well. But this is a little bit cleaner to do it this way. Okay. Then here we're just printing out the result 8, and we're done. Right. So that's number 2. Let's press ahead. Why don't we press ahead and look at the next one here. These examples kind of build off each other. When we look at question 3, it says output just the first word of the string. Okay, there's a variety of ways of solving this. The idea is the first word would be like the word everyone, right? That was the first word in the example that we originally saw above. Okay, and there's a connection here for with the example we just did in question number 2, is that location of the space, the first space, is an indication of where the first word is before that first space. So knowing that the first space is in location 8 is incredibly useful for finding the first word in the string. So let's go ahead and let's look at that. Let's go look at number 3. And there's a variety of ways of doing this. One way is to use this strn copy. It's a string copy where the n indicates how many characters are you copying. Okay. In this case, we want to copy 8 characters. This is the previous index of where the space is. Okay. Where the space is. This is the location of the first space character. Okay, so that was building off of the second problem or solution to the second question here. Assuming for this third question that the index has now been defined. Okay, a couple things to note. Your code will not work using this unless you've included the string library. Okay, if you did not include the string library, you'll get something when you try to run that statement saying like reference undefined, something along those lines. Okay, this line here, this first line, is indicating that I need space to store the first word. I'm just assigning it as 16. You can pick a number that's bigger or whatever you think kind of makes sense. And the string copy, what that's going to do is it's going to take everything from our original string, the quote, copy the first 8 characters, and stick the result into the first string. Okay, so that this way when I print the first string using S as our format specifier for printing strings, that we get just the first word. Okay. I think that's all there is to say on that one, except maybe to point out that you don't need to have memorized how to use something like that. What's a really common thing for people to do is to look at the string library and look at the documentation. Okay, to look at the documentation to say, okay, I'm trying to like basically copy bits of strings. I want to know what's available for me to use. I want to look in the string library, see what's defined in there, and see how to use it properly. Like, what are the inputs that are needed? Okay, it's a very powerful thing. You're not going to memorize that stuff, right? You'll start to learn some of the common ones by heart over time, but you're going to want to fall back on being able to look at common documentation to make sure you're using things properly. Okay, and that stuff's found online. When we get into the exams in the class, I'll be providing some documentation for you so you have things to reference, things that you can use. Okay. All right, so there's the last one here for this part. Let's go ahead and do that. This one's a little bit different in that what I want to do in this example is see if we can kind of figure out how to remove all the spaces, right? We want to display the entire original string, but remove all the spaces. So what that's basically doing is it's making one giant word, right? You see then this output here, there's no spaces in the output string. Okay, so let's see how we can go about tackling that problem. So here, I'm going to make a copy, another string of the same length as the original, or the same max length as the original string. And I'm just calling it no spaces. Call it whatever you want. This seems reasonable. And I'm going to iterate the entire original string. And what I'm doing is anytime that the original string is not a space, I'm going to copy it over into the other array. Okay. Now, here's the very important thing. Notice that there's different indexes being used for these different strings. Okay. This one's using I. This one's using J. We need two different indexes because what we really have is a situation that looks like this. Okay. I'm just going to imagine we had the original string. Imagine the original string looked like this. Okay. So let's say this is let's imagine that was our original, quote, okay, and then we're going to have our no spaces array of the same size. What happens is if it's not a space, each character is going to be copied over. Okay. If it is a space, notice that the I is incremented. So this will continue. The I will loop up here while J is still being referenced here. Okay. So that will move. Effect is that J will be pointing at a different index while I is pointing up here. J will be pointing down here. Okay. And then same thing when I gets here, J will be pointing at that location. Okay. So that when I gets incremented and points to this T, the effect is that as we have more and more words, more and more spaces, I and J will get further and further apart. Okay, so we need to increment them separately. I gets incremented in the loop, whereas J gets incremented kind of when we don't have a space. Okay, anytime we hit a space, J does not get incremented. Right? I'm going to put the null character, when we're done, I'm going to put the null character at the end of our no spaces array because I want to indicate that we're done. That's the final length of the string. Okay, very, very common mistake to miss that. The idea is if you miss that, the program will interpret the end of the string as being further out than it really is. Okay, because it's looking for the, just like we had done in the earlier question where we're actually looking for that null terminator to indicate the end of the string or the length of the string. If it's not there, you're going to continue to look for it further and further out. Okay, and then we're just printing it out. All right, so I'm going to stop this video here for this first part. I encourage you to look back through it, listen to it multiple times, follow up with me if you've got any questions. I'd be glad to go over it in office hours with you or answer some questions on Piazza or over email if anything is confusing that we just went over. And I will talk to you all soon. Take care. Bye.